There was the study of Aubert Aron from the 1950s, and for a long time that seemed to be sufficient. Most people in France thought that Aubert Aron, who had lived through the Vichy experience, who had been hidden in Vichy itself before escaping to Africa, and who had studied much of the trial records after the war, his book seemed to be the final word for a very long time. What I did that was different was I saw the German archives, is that I happened to read German also, that made it possible to establish with more exactitude what the Germans wanted and when they wanted it. The other thing that changed was that there was a public that was hungry for some different information or a different approach. The young people after 1968 no longer believed their parents' version of what had happened during the war. They were very eager to have a new look. I think that was the change of audience that also helped make my book widely read and accepted. I think that was the important shift behind the impact that my book had in 1973. But in the very important issue of policy toward Jews in France, Vichy went ahead of German demands. It's very important to establish what the Germans wanted at each particular time, because German policy toward Jews, while always hostile, evolved over time. And the first stage in German policy was one of segregation within Germany. Now, in 1940, when the Vichy regime was set up, the German policy toward Jews was expulsion. Nazi Germany wanted to push out as many Jews as possible, particularly the foreign refugees from Poland and elsewhere, but also Jews of German nationality. And in 1940, within the German administration, they tended to think of France as a destination for Jews, a place to send them, not a place that was supposed to be made free of Jews, Judenrein in the dreadful German term, but a place where one might send the German Jews. And in fact, in October 1940, the very same week when Marshal Pétain shook Adolf Hitler's hand at Montoire-sur-le-Loire, 6,000 German Jews from the Rhineland and Westphalia were loaded into cattle cars and expelled into the unoccupied zone, into Vichy France, to the great distress and agitation of the Vichy leaders, who protested strongly and perhaps were able to stop further shipments. The French position was a unique one. France was the only Western country, indeed the only country defeated by Germany that was given an armistice. Hitler wanted to have a regime that would not demand a large number of German occupation troops so that he could devote them to the attack on Britain. So there's this anomaly. It's not like any other occupied country where you have the Germans occupying part of the country and another important part of the country run by an autonomous domestic regime. The French have their own authority, and this was what Hitler wanted. The German authorities were not particularly interested in what Vichy France did with the Jews who were living in the unoccupied zone. That was the business of the French. Now, in the occupied zone, where the German army was established in the north and west of France, there indeed they took measures against Jews for military reasons, for reasons of military security. The French Jewish statute of October 3rd, 1940 was it was the product of Vichy's own policies without reference to the Germans. There is no trace of direct German pressure. One might argue that Vichy was trying to please Nazi Germany by adopting this policy, and on an occasion Pierre Laval used to say to Ambassador Abetz, look what we're doing, we're solving the Jewish problem in our country just as you are in yours. But it comes out of the 1930s, Vichy's policy toward Jews. It comes out of the severe reaction in the 1930s to the large number of Jewish refugees that came into France. France was one of the most generous countries in the world with respect to refugees in the 1930s, at a time when the United States refused to enlarge its quota, and Britain imposed strict limitations on the arrival of immigrants. France opened its doors in its traditional way, its traditional hospitality toward asylum seekers, and large numbers of Jews from Central Europe came into France in the 1930s and set off a powerful hostile reaction. This was the time of the Great Depression. Jobs were scarce. There was wide unemployment, and it was believed that the Jewish refugees would take jobs away from French people. And one can find pockets of intense hostility to Jewish immigrants in fields like jewelry, furs, and in the medical profession, for example, where the medical students in Paris actually went on strike in 1935 to insist upon a quota being placed on foreign students in the medical school, by which they meant Jewish students in the medical school. There were a great many people writing in other languages and expressing themselves in the cultural terms of other countries at a time when French people felt insecure about the future of the French language and the French culture. The third reason for hostility was the fear of war, and this became stronger and stronger in the 1930s, the later 1930s. At the time of the Munich Agreement of 1938, the feeling was very widespread that Jews in France, not only Jews of French nationality, but particularly foreign Jews who had come into the country, were pushing France into the war, while at the same time preventing France from preparing for war. And so there were pamphlets written about La Guerre Juive, the Jewish war, the war that the Jews want to avenge themselves against Hitler. And those concerns are expressed directly in the Jewish Statute of October 1940, and that was not something that the Germans had forced on them. The Nazis had forced on Vichy France, and that was, I think, perhaps the most important discovery in the German archives. So in that particular aspect of Vichy matters, France went ahead of what the Germans wanted. The German ordinance defined Jews in terms of religion, and one in the Vichy zone, one could fall under the Jewish statute if one had if one had two Jewish grandparents, but a spouse who was Jewish and practiced the Jewish religion as well. And so the criteria was somewhat more stringent in the Vichy zone than in the German zone. The statute of October 3rd and the law of the following day, October 4th, which gave the prefects the authority to put foreign Jews or Jewish refugees into camps in the southern zone. These measures were received favorably by some and with indifference by some, and negatively by a few people. There were a few letters of protest, but by and large, measures of quotas, measures that limited the economic and cultural influence of Jews, were very much in the wind in the 1930s. It was not a big issue in the fall of 1940 because there were other issues that seemed much more important in the daily life of many people. Their brothers or husbands or fathers were in German prisoner of war camps. There were beginning to be shortages of food. Families were separated by the two zones. The demarcation line was an immense obstacle to the restoration of business and the reunification of families. And of course, the defeat in itself was an immense sorrow to practically everybody. And under those circumstances, the Jewish statute does not seem to have aroused an enormous amount of interest. And so there were these heavily armed, heavily motorized units totaling about 30 or 40,000 German soldiers who were officially charged with fighting the resistance and arresting Jews. And so at all times, there were never enough German police. I think there were only about 3,000 German police in France. And so at all times, the Germans needed the Vichy police, and they're quite explicit about this, in order to carry out the arrests that were needed before the Jewish population of France could be taken away. And this was quite explicit. There was an agreement in 1942 about the role of the French police, the so-called Busquet-Auberg agreement between the Vichy police chief and the head of the SS forces in France, General Auberg, which accepted the French request that the French police do most of the arresting unless someone were actually directly attacking German soldiers, that the arrests be left to the French police. And the Germans said, fine, as long as the French police will arrest the enemies of Germany. And so the price of the quasi-independence of the Vichy police is that they also take part in the arrest of Jews, foreign Jews at first, but eventually everyone. In the summer of 1942, there was a powerful shift of opinion commented on by all the prefects. And this came about because of the public arrests that took place in the occupied zone, most particularly the great roundup of the Vélodrome d'Hiver in 16th and 17th of July 1942. But also in August 1942, the Vichy government had promised to deliver 10,000 Jews from the Vichy zone to the German authorities. And in August 42, those arrests took place, and the camps in which many Jewish refugees had been lodged in the southern zone, like Gurs and Rivesaltes, those camps were emptied, and foreign Jews elsewhere were rounded up. And there was a mix-up about the families, and so there was a separation of families, and then there was the arrest of children. And these scenes took place in broad daylight, and they were absolutely horrifying to a great many people in the Vichy zone, and to a great many people in Paris who were witness to these arrests. And there was a transformation of the utmost importance in public opinion. 5 of the bishops spoke out publicly in their Sunday sermons and in letters that circulated to their parish churches against these arrests. It was the first important rift between the Vichy government and important parts of the French elite, including the church, and indeed including elements of the army. For the first time, Vichy, which had been very much accepted by the elite of French administration and society, now appeared to have committed something unacceptable. And after that point, there's a profound shift of opinion, and a great many people began violating the Vichy ordinances and began receiving Jewish children. Farmers took in orphans, Catholic orphanages took in orphans, Jewish refugee children, and there was massive disobedience, massive refusal of Vichy's policy, which was now considered a German policy, because the Germans did indeed go farther and farther and farther, and were now engaged in deportation, and the rumors were already rife that deportation meant death. Wearing of the star in the northern zone was very badly received. It was considered precisely the sort of thing that the bishops have warned about. If you start touching people and property, then this goes beyond the legitimate defense of economic and cultural interests. And there were all sorts of hostile reactions. There were people who wore the star themselves, or who made up fantasy stars, and some of them indeed were arrested and deported. But the star was considered defamatory and humiliating, and it was rejected in the most fundamental way. And that was part of this profound shift of opinion, after which a great many people in France clandestinely assisted Jewish refugees. The public spectacle of the arrests, the Veldiv, the arrests in the south, and other parts of France as well, which denounced by 5 of the 80-some bishops, not by everybody, but important figures denounced these publicly. I think at this point things change quite radically, and Vichy, the Vichy government becomes conscious that they have to be careful about their own public opinion. And there's the famous meeting of September the 2nd, 1942. This is 42 already, not yet 43, where Laval tells the Germans that he can't simply furnish quantities of Jews as if he's in a monoprix or prix unique. And things slow down. They don't stop. It's a mistake to say that Vichy stopped cooperating with the arrests and the deportations. But the pace slowed down, and then it sped up again in early 43 because of the occupation of the southern zone. And but French police continued to be ordered to take part in the arrests, but many more police are reluctant to do it. Laval himself, who feels that he's losing public support, and there are prefects and police commanders and individual police officers who no longer obey the orders. When they're told to arrest someone, they go to the door and they say, I have orders to arrest you 1 hour from now, and I'm coming back in an hour. And when they come back, of course, everyone has disappeared. These sorts of things already happened at the Veldiv in July 1942, and in July 1942, Hitler has not yet lost the war. The position of the Vichy government with respect to the deportation was extremely important. If the Vichy government had not cooperated, it would have been much more difficult for the Germans to, first of all, the Germans would not have been able to arrest anybody in the unoccupied zone until they got there in November 1942, which would mean the first 4 months or so of the massive deportation of 42, southern France would not have been involved. Furthermore, when the deportation policy started, the mechanisms that Vichy had set up for its own policy of reducing Jewish influence, which is not the same as expulsion or extermination, but it has its own logic, and those mechanisms, including the registers and the Aryanization and all of the things that Vichy did for its own project, were useful, were helpful to the German deportation project, and Vichy did not let the refugees out of the camps in the south when the Germans came in. They did not destroy the registers and so forth. And so they made things worse than they should have been. Now, it is sometimes claimed that the numbers show that Vichy must have done something right, because 75% of the Jews were not taken, 25% were. But in Italy, 16% of the Jews were taken. The final score in France is that the foreign Jews were deported at about the same rate in Belgium as they were in France, about 40%, because they didn't speak very good French, they looked different, they didn't have networks of friends. The Jews of French nationality, many of whom had been there for many hundreds of years, had friends and associates, and they knew what to do, they were highly assimilated, and even so, 24,000 French citizens, Jews of French citizenship, were taken, which is a shockingly high number. It is sometimes claimed that the Vichy government really tried to defend French Jews and did so by helping the Germans take foreign Jews, and that's always seemed to me a shaky argument, since all the early legislation applied to French Jews as well as to foreign Jews. The statute of 1940 and the second statute of 1941 and the Aryanization program all affected French Jews. And so it's difficult to claim that the Vichy government really saved Jews of French nationality, because they had weakened them financially and professionally. Since the Germans weren't able to fill their trains with only the foreign Jews, they approached the Vichy government, asking them to denaturalize everyone who had been naturalized since 1927. There was a new law in 1927 that made the acquisition of French citizenship quite easy, and the anti-immigrant conservatives, reactionaries of the 1930s, spent a lot of time denouncing the law of 1927, and so it was a clever move to ask Vichy to denaturalize everyone who had achieved French citizenship under that law. And Laval was, I think, ready to do it, and Pétain would not do it, and that was an interesting act of refusal, of which there were not very many. It did make a difference, and in that instance, they certainly did make it harder for these people to be deported.